Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 16th of October. Today we have some updates, so let's start. First we're going to discuss the Kupiansk-Liman front line. As you can see, there are a lot of icons, but we can say that the front line hasn't been changed since the yesterday and the day before yesterday. The Ukrainians did, during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians did the same thing as they did before, trying to find the weakest point in the Russian defense orders configuration. They were trying to send some commando scouts, trying to do some recon in combat, but according to the Russian sources, all those attempts were failed. The Russians reported that if we're talking about, let's say, Kupiansk front line, they were trying to send some forces in the town by the name of Berestova, but as a result of Russian artillery and rocket attack, the Ukraine lost around 50 soldiers and 8 armored vehicles. If we're talking about Liman front line, the Ukrainians were trying to develop their bridgehead near Tarskoye, Yampolovka, Terny, near these towns. They were trying to move more forces in this area, were trying to cross Zhiribets river again, and as a result of those crossings, the Ukraine lost around 20 soldiers. Furthermore, in this area, as you can see, near a town by the name of Zagrizova, this one, the Russians reported, according to the Ministry of Defense, they destroyed around 3 M777 artillery systems in this area. But as you can see, their losses from the Ukrainian side are not so high as they used to be during the previous rocket attacks. So the front line is stable in this area. The Ukrainians are trying to accumulate more forces, trying to prepare before maybe possible upcoming offensive operation in this area. If we are talking about Seversk-Bakhmut front line, there are no changes in this area. The Russians are trying to storm Bakhmut from 3 sides: south, east and southeast area. They're taking block by block. The Ukrainians, to stop the Russian progress, moved more reinforcement in this area. So I believe that during the next weeks the Russians will try to reduce the Ukrainians as much as possible, because we know that Wagner forces are fighting in this area, but for now there are no progress at all. If we are talking about Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, during the previous days he made a video where he reported that situation near Bakhmut is very critical, but for now, till today, the Ukrainians are still there and they're holding this town, but we'll see what's going to be next. If we're talking about Donetsk, as you can see, there are a lot of icons. These towns were under very heavy artillery attack from the Ukrainian side. A lot of civilians were wounded, were killed during these days, during the previous hours. Furthermore, the Ukrainians were attacking not just Donetsk, but also now they have another very interesting target. The Ukrainians started shelling and attacking a town by the name of Belgorod. This town is located on the territory of Russian Federation. And maybe some of you saw a lot of videos from this morning of the local time that the Russians managed to shut down around 16 drones in the sky of Belgorod. So the Ukrainians were trying to understand what's going on there. Maybe they were planning to coordinate the Ukrainians attacking this area and Ukrainian HIMARS rockets, 777 artillery systems, and as a result of those attacks, a few civilians were wounded, some of them were killed in this area. And a very interesting update that during this morning of the local time, the Ukrainians were attacking Belgorod and the Ukrainians were attacking Donetsk. And somewhere at noon time, we got missile alarm all along the Ukrainian territory. Maybe you saw the map that there was like some kind of artillery alarm in Ukraine that the Russians, as a revenge of those attacks that were against Belgorod and Donetsk, the Russians sent, and the Ukrainian Telegram channels were saying that the Russians sent everything they have: rockets, Iskanders, Jaggers, rockets, and so on. But it was some kind of fake flag. The Russians sent just a few rockets, and mainly the Ukrainians started that alarm because of one thing, that if we're talking about Belarus, as we know, during the previous days, the president of Belarus and Putin reported that they're planning to prepare another powerful attack feast in the territory of Belarus. And if we're talking about the number of forces, there are no numbers, there is no information, but today we got update that the Russians have already sent around 9,000 of Russian soldiers on the territory of Belarus. I believe that they're planning to increase, and they're planning to make something around 20 or 30,000 soldiers of the Russians on the territory of Belarus. And I believe that the Belarus government are planning to mobilize the army around 70,000. So the number that the United group are planning to be is around 100,000 soldiers on the territory of Belarus. And today the Russians moved their MiG-31 airplanes on the territory of Belarus. This is the planes that are able to carry Jager rockets. So during this day, the Belarus decided to raise up these MiG-31 with these Jager rockets. So this is the reason why the Ukrainians started the rocket artillery alarm all along the Ukraine, because they understand that with these Jager rockets, the Russians are able to reach any target in territory of Ukraine. But these aircraft didn't send the rockets, didn't attack the Ukraine. They were just some kind of just raised the airplanes in the sky, and that's it. So as I told you just a minute ago, that the Belarus and Russia are planning to deploy around a lot of forces on the south of Ukraine. My projection that they're planning to deploy around 100,000 soldiers. If they are planning, the Russians and the forces from Belarus are planning to attack the Ukraine from the north, from the territory of Belarus, I believe that they need around at least 150,000 soldiers. This is the real number that they can use, and with help of this number, they at least are able to take control over some territories like Chernigov, like Sumy, or like Sarny, or like Kherson or Zhytomyr. With this number of forces, they are able to take control over some territories. If they want to deploy just around 20,000 soldiers, of course, we understand that it's some kind of fake flag, and the main goal of such forces is to force the Ukrainians to move the same number of the forces from the east side, from the front line to this area. And of course, you won't be able to hold this army from the territory of Belarus if you're just using the infantry. Of course, in this case, you need to hold some air defense forces, some tanks, some armored vehicles, and so on. So, and this very interesting story, because as you know, today we got a very interesting report from Kiev, and to be more precise, from Chinese embassy. They requested the civilians, the citizens of China, to leave Ukraine as soon as possible. And also we got rebate today from the Serbia, the small country in the Europe, from their embassy, that they're also planning to close their embassy in Ukraine, and they requested their citizens to leave Ukraine. And today, for now, if we're talking about today, there are around 11 countries that decided to close their embassy on the territory of Ukraine. And the most interesting, if you follow the Russian Telegram channels, the Russian military expert, they are saying that all of those embassies and their heads decided to make such a decision to close their embassy on the territory of Ukraine after some kind of, let's say, consultations with Moscow. So there were some kind of consultations between Chinese, India, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Serbia embassies, and so on with Moscow. And after that, all those embassies decided to close their representatives on the territory of Ukraine, and they requested all their citizenship to leave the territory of Ukraine. And all these things are happening at the same time when the Russians decided to deploy with the Belarus forces, some forces on the south of Belarus. I believe that you saw a lot of videos with the convoys of the Russian armored vehicles, tanks that were moving from the territory of Russian Federation, the territory of Belarus. I'm not sure that the Russians will start anything in this direction, but anyway, as we discussed, we know that the situation on the front lines on the south and the east are stable, and it's very difficult for both sides to develop their progress, and the Ukrainians are not able to correct the Russians, to penetrate Russian defense orders. The Russians, it's very difficult for them to take Bakhmut. They're storming Bakhmut since the end of May, and we can say that there are almost no progress, so everything is stable, everything is there are a lot of forces from both sides. So of course we understand that if the Russians want to start negotiation process, if the Russians want to finish this special operation, they need to force Kiev to start negotiation. But the only one way how to do this is to move their forces as close as possible to Kiev. And to do this, as we discussed many videos in a row on my channel, they are able to take Chernigov, Sumy, and to get as close as possible, or from the east side, or to attack the Rovno power plant on the west, and let's say Zhytomyr on the west, and to attack Kiev from the west, and this with the same purpose, to force the Kiev to start negotiations. So maybe the Russians are planning to use this tactic. Anyway, most of the experts are saying that we are going to see something new from the Russians in the beginning of November. And let's return back to the front lines. And as a result of the heavy clashes on the Kupiansk-Liman front line, the Ukraine lost around 70 soldiers and 8 armored vehicles. Very interesting updates are coming from Ugledar front line, from Zaporozhye front line, Ugledar front line. There are very heavy clashes between the Russians' position in a town by the name of Neskuchная Vremovka. According to this map, Vremovka, this town is under Ukrainian control. This town is located on the west from Velika Novoselovka. This is the Ugledar front line. There are a lot of forces, Ukrainian forces in this area. And but there was an update a few weeks maybe ago, that the Russians reported that this town Vremovka is under Russian control. Maybe we because of the fact that we received just one confirmation of that, this map decided not to be updated. But anyway, today, the second day in a row, because yesterday there were almost the same updates, that there are very heavy clashes in this area, that the Russians managed to take control over some landfills in this area, over some strategic highlands. And if we're talking about today, the Ukrainians during the previous 24 hours lost around 40 soldiers and 4 armored vehicles in the clashes around Velika Novoselovka, and to be precise, around Vremovka. But if we're talking about other situation on the front line, this front line in this area is stable as well. Now we are moving to the Kherson area. Today we got the first numbers. Of the clashes of the Ukrainian attempt of counteroffensive operation in this area. If you remember, yesterday we discussed that the Ukrainians made another attempt to storm the Russian forces on the line between Bruskinskaya, Sadok, Petykhatka, and Duchan in this area. They used around 3 tactical battalion groups, and there was 1 tank battalion, tactical battalion group, so there were a lot of forces. And they were trying to storm this area, and the Russians reported that as a result of those attacks, the Ukrainians lost around 350 soldiers and something around 36 or 37 armored vehicles, including tanks. It's not like something new. It's not the first time we see that the Ukrainians have a lot of losses during their counteroffensive operation. They had almost the same losses during their offensive operation near Bilogorovka, Andreevka. On this bridgehead, we had almost the same numbers when the Russians first time were trying to attack Vysokopolye in this area. But if we compare the Ukrainian counteroffensive operation that they did yesterday with the previous counteroffensive operation that they did in the end of August and in the beginning of September, there is one important difference. And that's why I believe that Ukrainians maybe are planning to change their plans according to this region, and maybe they will not do anything in this area. I'll try to explain to you what is the difference between the offensive operation that we saw during the previous 24 hours and those offensive operations that we saw in the end of August and the beginning of September. The thing is that the Ukrainians used a lot of forces, but the thing is that the Ukrainian forces couldn't even get the Russians' defense positions. And this is the most important. So just imagine yourself, the Ukrainians were using 2 tactical battalion mechanized groups with infantry, with armored vehicles, with mobile trucks, mobile cars, and so on. There also was 1 tactical tank battalion group, totally armored, a lot of forces, and they were trying to storm the Russians all along the front line. but they were destroyed and they were defeated, we can say it, during the launching of their engines. The Ukrainians couldn't even cross more than 10 kilometers. And they couldn't even get to the Russian defense positions. So, if to tell all this, to describe the situation in a simple way, the Ukrainians started their offensive operation, but they couldn't even make even a shot. So, if we are doing offensive operation, we start offensive, we see the enemy position, we start storming, attacking them. But during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians couldn't even see the Russians' defense positions. They were completely defeated by the air carriers, aircrafts, artilleries on the stage when they were starting their engines. And this is very important because the Ukrainians didn't plan to be so unsuccessful. Of course, they were trying to do something. Maybe they were trying to make some recon in combat, trying to understand where the Russians' artillery position. But as I understand, they didn't expect to see such a result. And now the Ukrainians understand that I believe this will be very highly unlikely to crack this area to get Berislav or to get Kherson. And this is the reason why the Ukrainians, it was like yesterday, and this is the reason why the Ukrainians started shelling heavily, very aggressively, the Belgorod town, this town, and Donetsk town. You see that the Ukrainians have two options, how to receive the Western support, and to be more precise, how to receive the support from democrats of the United States of America, because we understand this is the only force in the United States of America, not the only force, but this is the most powerful force who supports the Ukrainians, the Democracy Party in the United States of America. And we understand that there are going to be some kind of elections on November, and this party, they need to show some progress and some success, or they need to show something, some events, and they need to get as much points as possible before these elections. And of course, there are two options. Or the Ukrainians need to show progress, and let's say if we're talking about if the Ukrainians were able to show some progress during offensive operation against Kherson, of course it might bring some points to the Western countries, to the Western support, and it might show the Western countries that they can continue supporting the Ukrainians. This is the first option. But according to the previous 24 hours, we see that the Ukrainians were defeated, so that means that this is not an option. And the second option that Ukrainians can use to receive support is to show to the world, to the Western media, that the Russians are very aggressive, that they're very angry, that they're very, I don't know how to say. So they need to show the casualties among civilians. They need to show the losses and the damage that the Russians are doing to the Ukraine during their rocket and artillery attacks and so on. But the Russians, if we're talking about the Russians, they were saying that during, if you remember, the beginning of this week, the Russians attacked the energy facilities of the Ukraine, and they destroyed around 30% of that facilities. But after that, they suddenly stopped. They stopped and they decided not to continue doing this. And I'll explain to you why. The Russian sources are saying that the Russians, they understand that for them, if we're talking about the Russians, it's much more better for them to work with the Republicans from the United States of America, but not with the Democracy Party. So that's why they understand that they need to be to take a pause, a small pause, and not to freeze the situation, and not to allow the situation to develop not in a very good way. So that's why the Russians decided to stop. They decided to wait until the elections on the 8th of November finished, and after that they will see if the Democracy Party is going to win. Then the Russians will continue their shelling, maybe even with more aggression and so on. But if Republicans are going to win, of course the Russians maybe it will be the first step to start negotiations on something like this, and everybody understand this. And that's why the Ukrainians started shelling and attacking Belgorod and Donetsk today with very big aggression. Why is that? Because they understand if they attack this town, that means that the Russians need to answer, need to start attacking from their side. And that was the situation for today. The Ukrainians attacked those towns, and then the Russians sent just a few calibers, just a few, and also the Russians raised these MiG-31 on the territory of Belarus. with the Jagger rockets, and the Ukrainians learned about artillery attacks and so on. But as you can see, nothing happened during today. Nothing happened because the Russians understand they need to take a pause. They need to wait the 8th of November. They don't need to bother the Western media. They don't need to create some terrible stories about attacking, let's say, civilians, about casualties among civilians, because Ukrainians, they prepared for this. Of course, they will make a lot of videos about that civilians were killed during Russian rockets and so on. And this is the second option, how the Ukrainians can get the Western support to show the casualties among civilians. But the Russians, they stop, they hold themselves, they take some patience in this area, in this situation, and they decided to wait until the 8th of November. And after that, according to the elections in the United States of America, they will make a decision what to do next. And this is very interesting, as you can see. So we'll follow this situation, trying to understand what is going to be next. But I'll repeat myself, till the 8th of November, most of the Russian experts are saying that the Russians decide to take a pause until election in the United States of America are going to end. And after that, they will make a decision what to do next, according to the result of those elections. Also, I'd like to talk with you about another very interesting situation that took place in Belgorod. Yesterday, maybe some of you heard about the situation that during the mobilization process, the Russians, before sending forces on the front line, they are trying to train them, to learn them, to with using the guns, tanks, and so on. And yesterday there was a case that two people from mobilized started attacking the Russian troops, Russian mobilized forces, and as a result of that attack, the Russian lost around 11 soldiers killed and something more 15 soldiers wounded. And it's like a terrible situation. There was a lot of updates, and if we're talking about those two attackers, those two people who were attacking they were also from the mobilized forces, and they were the citizens of Uzbekistan. This is the Uzbekistan, the country in the Asia. This one, Uzbekistan, as you can see, this country is very close to Afghanistan. And there were not terrorists, and the Russians, some sources were saying that during this training process, these two guys from Uzbekistan, they're Muslims, they were trying to do some religion things. They were trying maybe to pray to Allah or maybe something like this. And according on the basis of that situation, because of the fact that maybe during these trainings, during these runnings, they were trying to pray to their God, there was some kind of conflict between these two guys from Uzbekistan and with the soldiers who wasn't from Uzbekistan, and there was a conflict, and as a result of that conflict, those guys started attacking the Russians with machine gun and AK-47. As a result, around 11 soldiers were killed and something around 15 soldiers were wounded. So that was the case that happened in Belgorod. The first things some Russian experts were trying to say that was another Ukrainian terrorist attack, but as far as I understand, as far as I see, it wasn't like that. It was just a case. It was a result of conflict between Muslims and in Russian army who was mobilized, and just regular guys who was on the another side of this conflict. And that's it for today. Military Summer channel reminds you can condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, and join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.